devastating rates of chronic illness and intergenerational poverty. So much of the historical and ongoing trauma of our communities face today have been a result of suppressing our rights, denying our self-determination, disenfranchisement from decision-making processes, and restricting access to homelands. And the land also tells this ongoing story as landscapes and ecosystems continue to change. When I introduce myself in my ancestral language, as I did at the beginning, I'm telling you that the history of this place is a part of my personal history as an Indigenous person. What it doesn't tell you is that because of this history, I'm the first generation on my maternal side in over 100 years to be raised by their parents. I still get goosebumps every time I say that. Without knowing Indigenous people's history, you will not know how hard it was for me as a youth and a young adult, seeking out pieces of my identity anywhere I could find it. You won't know how difficult it is to practice our culture and lifeways without access to our homelands. I share this with you because this whole story, because our foodways, I think, are one of the greatest examples of Indigenous resilience and our ongoing resistance. I tell these stories because Anishinaabe people have been actively stewarding and managing this territory for as long as we've been here. This territory was not some untouched wilderness. As I said, it was lovingly cultivated and has been fiercely protected by generations. Telling the story honors the generations before us who safeguarded this land and water. It tells the stories of people who have kept this knowledge, these foodways, and land management practices alive. People whose names we may never know, but who were thinking of us. And this story also begins to tell you of the people doing tremendous work today. You see, as I was going through this process of, as I call it, coming home to myself, I searched for our narratives in the voice of Native authors and found pieces of myself in their words. People like Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who is a Potawatomi biologist and author of Breeding Sweetgrass, who so gracefully weaves together traditional ecological knowledge, cultural teachings, and Western science. She is uplifting thousands of years of ancestral knowledge, showing the world its relevance and importance, and that there are things that Western science cannot yet measure or explain. Robin, in her book, Breeding Sweetgrass, beautifully articulates this concept of the honorable harvest, which are these kind of relationship with the land by viewing it as kin rather than a resource. She said if she was to actually write down what the honorable harvest is in words, this is what it might say. Ask permission of the ones whose lives you seek. Never take the first, never take the last. Harvest in a way that minimizes harm. Take only what you need and leave some for others. Use everything that you take. Take only that which is given to you. Share it, as the earth has shared with you. Be grateful. Reciprocate the gift. Sustain the ones who sustain you, and the earth will last forever. The story also starts to tell of other people, like my seed mentor, Ron White, who is a Mohawk seed keeper and farmer, from whom I have had a great honor of learning the important responsibility of a seed keeper. She's taught me what it means to be a responsible descendant and a good ancestor at the same time. Because we have to see ourselves as living on that continuum. And I mean, that's a huge thing to reflect on. Is like, how do I act responsibly with the things that my ancestors have given me? So how am I a responsible descendant? But also thinking of myself as that future ancestor and living your life accordingly. Actually, the word, when I was learning more of the Anishinaabe language, I wanted to know, after I learned that from Rowan, I was like, what is our word for ancestor? And so when I went looking, I was really amazed. I mean, our language just continues to amaze me in so many ways, but the word for ancestor is the same word as descendant. So it's built right into our language, that way of thinking. It's someone that you're linked to, both forward and back. And so, as I said, she's taught me, been one of my most influential teachers in thinking that way, and I think of myself and that responsibility, and how to safeguard the gifts that have been left in our care, how to best care for plant relatives and save heirloom seeds, because they're not only our relatives, but they also hold the collective stories of generations, as I was saying earlier. And so when I care for them, I'm also caring for these generations of people's work before me. And she has guided me into reorienting my sense of time to align with the world's natural rhythms and cycles. And has really emphasized this concept of what she calls a kin-centric food system. She has prepared me to steward this knowledge for future generations, just like previous generations did for us. You know, leads up to people like Sean Sherman, also known as the sous chef out of the Twin Cities, who him and the rest of his team are bringing indigenous cuisine to the forefront of American culture. Their recipes are made from the local landscape, helping us to both protect and celebrate the abundant gifts around us. And their work is helping indigenous communities across the continent reestablish their traditional food systems as well. Actually, the Indigenous Food Lab is their nonprofit that they started within the last couple years, that's doing that work of supporting communities who are working to revitalize their food systems. If you're not familiar, this is Sean here in the back row. With the help of my ancestors and generous teachers, I've realized existence depends on it. So I was saying earlier, like, I wholeheartedly believe that things will keep going, but whether or not we're here is another question. We all come from land-based people and practices. I firmly believe that your ancestors are waiting for you to remember them. For some of us, this is much harder to do, and we can only trace our footsteps back so far. My grief, compassion, and solidarity for you is deep. But each of you can cultivate a deeper relationship with and knowledge of the place you live now. Each of us that consider this place home have a responsibility to this place and to each other. Moving forward, I hope that when you're sharing the history of this place, you acknowledge the experience and contributions of Indigenous peoples. I ask that when you're crafting land acknowledgements and introducing yourself, you place yourself in relationship to this particular land and acknowledge the Indigenous communities whose ancestral territory this is. Indigenous communities are often invisible to the larger society and are spoken of in the past tense, but we are still here. Our sovereignty movements, whether they're about legal rights, seed sovereignty, food sovereignty, are essential to the survival of our cultures, traditions, languages, spirituality, health, and identities. But we also know that our healing, liberation, and survival is intertwined with yours. I urge all of you to ensure our work and narratives that we craft are intentionally inclusive. Otherwise, we'll continue to perpetuate systems of oppression and erasure. None of us here are responsible for the past, but we are responsible for the world we leave to our descendants. That's kind of the closing of like the narrative piece of thank you for holding your questions. I would love to just open it up for questions and discussion for the remaining time that we have. I didn't.
Where did you get that photo?
When I was doing the GA work. So it's, and I actually, so what I was saying, the first generation, 100 years, be raised by their parents and mom's side of the family. I didn't really know that fact, like I didn't click until maybe about 6 years ago when I was doing more of this genealogy, and my husband said, he said it first. He's like, you realize, you know, that first generation in over 100 years, and I'm like, oh, again, remind me that's why this is so hard. And so, my mom was raised in a foster home, and her mom went to boarding school, and I was sent, after boarding school, I was sent to live with some people that were excited. Called relatives, but one of their family. And her parents went to boarding school, so they give me additional leads, and like because of that, like when my grandma passed away last year, when my mom and aunt were sorting through her belongings, they found a storage tub of they're not diaries, but writings of my grandma's, where she was actually writing memoirs and things. She was like. So, in very, in her forethought, she probably didn't know anyone was going to really do that. She named it the Inheritance. And I just feel like that's so profound. Like, and my mom and grandma's like, this belongs with you. Like, and when I was, this is probably good. I'll wrap up like the family stuff here in a second. Because it's kind of going to, you know, longer thing than what you had asked, but probably I think I was about 27. I was helping my mom go through some things in her basement, and I found this plastic bag on papers, and I started figuring out what it was, and it was actually the first couple pages of the writing, so I knew it kind of existed, but I didn't know how much of it existed. And I didn't really have any relationship to speak of with my grandmother at the time, but I wrote her a letter, and I said, listen, I found these papers of yours in my mom's basement, and I realized that your story is part of my story, and if you're ever willing to sit down and share more, like, let me know. And she wrote me a letter back and said that I was the only grandchild that ever showed me interest, which broke my heart. And she said she wanted to go visit her siblings up in Cascade. She said, I'll pay for the everything, the gas, but I can't make the drive by myself anymore. Will you take me up there? And so when I was 27, I spent the first alone time with my grandma ever. And she was a complete open book. And a lot of the questions I had, she completely offered up without any ask. That was the first time I had met like extended family. As I was saying with Jason, it's been a very hard path. Like I had a lot of people professionally like discourage me from focusing on systems. Like they're like, there's no future in this. Like choose something else. But there have been things like that that have continually reaffirmed like I'm right where I need to be right now. Like continue to be this. But I'm like this usually, you know, when I'm talking about this stuff.
I just think that time with your grandmother, that's priceless. I mean, all my grandparents are gone by the time I was 12. And both my parents are gone, and I realized how many things I didn't ask them in their life. And now I don't have an easy way to get that information. I can go online, but that's very
And it's not the same.
and it's not all the same.
My grandma actually that weekend that I spent with her, she I forget how it came up, but she was saying that every generation there's a family historian, and then she kind of smiled at me with a very knowing smile, like she knew it was me. And so, like, again, it's like kind of meant, I guess, in a way that I don't feel like I even fate, or at least predestined things, but it was meant for me, you know, to be the caretaker of that. And so now I'm getting to spend more time with hers and going through that, and then thinking about, who knows, maybe it's meant to be just for the family, like, transcribed, so that they can read it. Maybe there's a larger story, like an intergenerational story that has to be told. It's still unfolding.
Well, you're here now in front of our class, so you are doing that.
These questions are going to betray my ignorance, but what do you know the general population, or is there a way to know the population of Anishinaabe people in the Great Lakes area? And then, is there a central community or a center somewhere where your culture can learn more, you know, kind of
Those are great questions.
unified?
Yeah, those are great questions. So, the population thing is a little tricky because it depends on if you're using like self-identified people versus tribal citizens, like people that are recognized by the federal government or even by a tribal government. Those are different numbers. I will say in Southeast Michigan, last time I saw the numbers, it was like people that had self-identified were about 40-some thousand. But that's also people that are identified as multiracial. So, I mean, that's another factor to consider too. I think I think it's American Fact Finder is like the website that's affiliated with the census. Within the last few years, has some new, like a new offshoot website where you can find populations by nationhood, tribal nationhood. So where he actually, him and his students, looked back and whatever documents they could find about what plants, well, in general, they weren't just looking at plants. What foods were here in the Great Lakes region prior to European contact? That doesn't mean they weren't traded with native communities in other regions, because things were always moving around. But they were looking here in the Great Lakes region prior to contact, and that spreadsheet that they put to compile as part of the research is available publicly. I know that.
And who did the research?
Pardon?
Who did the research?
Dr. Martin Reinhardt. And there is a public Facebook group, Decolonizing the Diet, where folks, share different resources. But basically what they were looking at is like, what happens if we commit a certain portion of our diet to just those foods. They were doing like all sorts of health screening biometrics throughout the study to show like if I commit 50% of my diet, how did that impact my health? Some people did 100%, and they were documenting and journaling like the impact, not only how difficult it was today to do that, but how their relationship to certain things changed as they were going out and foraging or learning to hunt or learning to process a deer for the first time, and so he also has a cookbook that he and other participants in the study is put together. Definitely check out his work though, it's really super interesting.
Places are like exhibits exchange. Are there indigenous focused seed banks that attach the story to the back of the seed essentially, where you can learn about, based on the variety you find, resources like that?
There are not so many, well, not seed companies.
Right. But exchanges of some sort? Or
Yeah, there are tons.
databases?
Like, I wouldn't stretch so far as saying like every community, but most, I would say most native communities that I know of have some type of exchange or library or some type of initiative going on, to help especially preserve that knowledge about their particular foods. As far as like publicly available information, there aren't many good resources. There aren't, I don't think, any really great resources right now. That's something, when I first started working for NAFSA, I was coordinating the Seed Keepers Network. And that was like one of the main goals that our network members said they really wanted to, I guess, further discuss is like possibly creating like a database with each other to help compile that information, because so-and-so over here might have knowledge about how to grow a particular seed, but this person over here knows how to cook it and like knows some other piece of its story, but like how do we bring all that together in a way that really honors the communities of origin? And you know, because there's some information that's not intended to be shared outside the community. And so how do we do that in a respectful way and take all those cultural protocols into account? And so before we made very much movement, I thought I'd transitioned to a different role, but our current network coordinator is continuing that conversation. So maybe within the next couple of years, there might be some type of like pilot of something like that.
It's a hard subject because everyone will always say, well, I was born here, I don't know how to get to that. But you know, if you're now in the paradigm where we are, where people are property owners and you have land and you're trying to be stewards, you know, what can, you know, the white man, me, do to share the wild strawberries that come up in my yard, you know, and I don't mow those things down, or I try to look for naturalist-based group that's trying to allow the native plants to thrive. You have this resource of like 40 people. What, you know, is it open up your property to student groups to meet in late June to pick the heartberries, or is it, you know, how do you help and be a good ally in that sense? Yes.
My always go-to response about that is like ask the particular group that you want to be in relationship with. So if it's the student group, ask them, because they're probably going to say something different that I probably would never think of. And the community over here is probably going to have different priorities than what I'm thinking of. But yeah, it could look like opening up your space and saying like, hey, like when the strawberries, the O'David are ripe, like y'all are welcome to come out. Like I've had people offer space to me to come out and hunt or to do foraging. Another quick example just came to mind is I have a colleague who does like public policy work in the daytime, but he's also a pastor, and his church does a lot of food justice work. And he came to me, I think it was last year, and said, you know, I had been given these, actually some of those lobotomy beans, those red, black, white ones that I showed earlier, and said, you know, what should I do with these? Should I even grow these? Like, and I'm like, well, go ask the lobotomy folks over here, first of all. I might give you some suggestions, but really it matters what they think, because it's their relative, you know, the lobotomy seeds are. But what they ended up deciding on is that their congregation would grow out the seed, and then the daughter seeds would go home. Some people call this process renutriation. So returning the seeds back to the communities of origin. And the university is doing some of that work here. There's renutriation work happening at the Arboretum. Or at Mathi, there's like this protected courtyard. So they're really thinking about how they can return those to the communities.
So we're all here because we want to know more about Michigan natural history, right? But if we end up considering or including in anything we're doing, like some sort of land acknowledgement, and then also recognizing that the indigenous people are still present, right? Is it an overstep, or I look for your guidance? Oh, also, thank you for sharing your story. Should have started with that. I'm looking for guidance on, particularly because I teach a high school organismal biology class, and to recognize the indigenous people's continued presence in the area and their ways of knowing. Is it an overstep because of my identities to try to have them learn indigenous names for organisms? Because that's part of my class, is you gotta know these organisms. But right, like I'm using colonizer names for those organisms. And I'm sort of asking, particularly because of a phrase use of poetry of the language, right? So is it even useful for me, if you say, yeah, go for it, is it even useful for me to teach those names if I'm not also teaching and understanding the rest of the language? I think that gets my question across. Yeah. And I'm only looking for guidance, I'm not necessarily looking for an answer.
I'll start with the land acknowledgement thing and get to the language piece, because there's something I always like to share with folks, is that land acknowledgements in theory are really great, but there has to be more than just the words. Like, I always encourage people to, like, even if you're just doing that as an individual, say what your individual commitment is. Like, by me saying this statement, I am committing to sharing a more inclusive history. It can be something as simple as that. MSU has some really great guidance around land acknowledgements and crafting those. But I always encourage folks to think, like, what is the meaningful action or commitment that you're pairing that with? Otherwise, it's just hollow words. Like, great, you acknowledged it, so what? Like, and I know a lot of Native people that really, like, it makes them super angry unless there's like something attached to it. The language piece, my initial reaction is that sharing indigenous names is a great idea. I'm trying to think of what my language teachers would say right now.
Right.
And I don't, at least off the top of my mind, I don't see any potential problem with that. Because it definitely too, even if it's certain ones that you maybe do a little bit more research about, like, what is the language saying about, because our language is action based, or the name of things says what it does, or what its purpose and function is. It's not like a noun based language, or I think that's partly the property ownership kind of like worldview. So if you were to unpack a few of those words, I think that would make it more meaningful. Like, this is what the Anishinaabe language is saying this particular relative or thing does. There are some, I'm trying to think off the top of my mind, some really great language resources. I can't, it's Minnesota something. If you search Minnesota Ojibwe language or Ojibwe dictionary, they have recordings for everything, so you can get the pronunciation.
My question is kind of two-part. Okay, so I'm a big fan of not watering down tragedies and the things that have happened in the past. A lot of times when we talk about them, we like to put flowery language on it, and that isn't a great way of expressing how horrific it was. So, first off, I have a question about wording my actual question. Is it appropriate to say what you and your family have gone through is cultural genocide?
I would say it is, yeah.
Thank you. So keeping that in mind, when you've gone through something as absolutely heart-wrenching and terrifying as your family has gone through, the loss of your culture, that's losing music and art and oral histories and all of these things, you were drawn specifically to seeds and food and plants, and that's beautiful and wonderful, but I'm wondering, what exactly was it about these things that called to you more than everything else you lost?
I think there's a lot of things, trying to make it short, which I'm not very succinct today. One is on my paternal side, my grandmother immigrated from Germany shortly after World War II, and she was the grandmother I was able to have a relationship with. And she had a lot of pressure because it was unpopular to be German right after World War II in the United States. Really held on tight to her culture and made sure that as we were growing up, she gave as much of that as she could, her German culture, mostly through food, her love language. And so I was always in the kitchen with her and asking questions and things. And so I think it was partly that that love of food, that love language that started with my other grandma. But also when I was in the end of my undergrad, so my background was in social work, FYI, and at the end of my undergraduate program, I was volunteer coordinator in a community garden, and I saw the power that gardening and food had to like really be really therapeutic for individuals, and for it could be like a mechanism for change for communities. And even in the short time that I was in that role, and I started asking, because of the genealogy work I was doing at the same time, I started asking myself, I wonder what my indigenous ancestors were eating, what their foods are, and just like started like digging into some of those questions. And then when I started grad school, like by that time I was like, which I went right into grad school here at UMM, and I was like, yeah, food systems is like a really cool way to like analyze things, to like understand issues, all sorts of issues, partially because there are so many things that intersect with it: the environment, health, the economy, the culture, like all these things. And so it really, food systems started becoming this lens of like how to think about the past and also the contemporary things that were going on. And then I started thinking, like, I used like all of my assignments to basically to learn more about like contemporary issues facing indigenous communities, because I wanted to know more about and continue to get connected with my community. Like, I was trying to figure this stuff out. Not that I have it figured out now, but a little bit more than I did at that time. And so food really became like that pathway for a lot of that stuff to take place. And like I was saying, like there have been so many times on this personal and professional journey where it's been reaffirmed, like, keep doing this. Like, I know your advisor just discouraged you, don't do that. Like, there's no future as a social worker, like, doing food systems work, what are you doing? But I knew, like, as an Indigenous woman, like, there were so many things facing my community that intersected around food that, like, how could I do anything else? And, like, you know, also, like, some of the best conversations happen around the table when we're sharing a meal. Like, a lot of people's barriers come down where we're able to connect with each other. It's just, I think it's a great way for so many good things to happen. Like I said, a lot of things, but.
Kind of a weird question, but we're talking about seeds and controlled burns and just anger, right? I would imagine, hearing your story, that you've experienced a lot of anger thinking about this stuff. I know that you have a lot of anger. And how do you, kind of like a controlled burn, because you obviously are doing a lot of good work, so how do you control that so that you can do the good work rather than letting it just kind of consume everything?
Well, I will say that you guys are learning a lot. I'm usually an open book anyhow, but you guys are learning a lot about me today. I think when I was a lot younger, it manifested more as like depression and sadness, because there's like this huge hole. Like, I knew these things were missing, but I didn't know what they were, and I didn't even a lot of times know what questions to ask to fill it. And I got more angry once I learned more. And I knew who to be angry at, like this larger system, and you know, I could point it somewhere, but I think that I do remember an article I read when I was in grad school. It was a short one, but it talked, I think it was called Tempered Radicals. And it talked, you know, about, those two words usually don't go together, but it really talked about how do you focus that energy into something that's productive instead of something that's destructive. You just hold it all inside. And that was about the time I started getting really angry too, so it was really helpful that I read that at that time. And so that really stuck with me of like, you know, how do I focus that energy into something that is healing for myself and for other people? And also, like, what do they say, the best revenge is living well. So instead of all the other things places I could have placed that, I was like, I'm gonna eat some really good food. I'm gonna talk about eating really good food to people. I'm gonna plant a garden. You know, I'm gonna go over here and meet some new friends or relatives and reconnect with them. And so there were a lot of things that I just found were a better use of my time. And I know that's probably a really simplistic way of putting it, but it seemed like a better investment in my energy, like, because any social justice work is like, can be really draining if you're not like filling up your cup. And so I had to find stuff that were, as my elders say, life affirming, the things that kept filling my cup. And over time it's gotten a lot easier. I've also gotten less of a filter as I've gotten older, and that helps a lot too. It's like, I feel very secure in what my truth is here, getting up and share this story with you. Like, it was really hard at first. Like, the first time I got up and shared that story, like, absolutely trembled, because I wasn't even sure, like, should I be speaking this aloud? How are people gonna perceive me? And now I just don't really care, like, because, like, I've earned the right to stand up here and own this story. Like, it's been really hard, and like, I feel like it also honors like my grandparents and all my ancestors that didn't have the opportunity to get up and share this story. And so, I hope that answered your question.
So on a grander, if you had a wish or wishes to make huge change for everybody you can't undo what's been done, but to make the world a better place for Indigenous people, what would you do? Like, if the sky was the limit, if you could do something big?
I don't know if it's a one specific thing, but it's why I work in food sovereignty. I would encourage you all, if you're not familiar with that term, like what the movement is about, like look it up and read about it. Some people will say it's about making the food system more democratic, but I think it's about fundamentally changing our food system and the way that we relate to the rest of all the different pieces of it.
So is there a policy that you could?
The way we think about land tenure, like moving away from private land ownership and starting to think about communally, like, and like how we exchange and distribute land in a way that allows everyone to live like well and not just struggle and get by. Like, I think because that's a common thing across, you know, Black food sovereignty movements and Native food sovereignty movements and just like all these different things. A lot of it comes down to land access. And I think a pivotal piece that needs to change is the ownership piece and rethinking that. There are so many other models that communities are using or trying out, like why not? Like, a lot of this stuff is like that I guess are causing problems it's a social construct, it's human made. That gives me hope. A lot of people are like that, you know, they don't see hope in that, but I find a lot of, I think you were talking about hope before we started, right? And I find a lot of hope in that because that means that there are endless possibilities of other ways we could be, if we're willing. Like, we're probably gonna have to live more locally, because like big systems, big ships are hard to turn. And you can't, you know, really focus on local priorities and issues like in a global context or in a global way. Like you just can't apply things universally to everyone and say this is what a food system should look like, because it's not going to work for everybody. But I think the ownership and tenure piece is going to be an important piece of, has been an important piece, but it will continue to be an important piece of how we all move forward. And water too, with that.
I've been not put food in your mouth without it being influenced by the native food systems and culture and tradition, and we're sitting there eating some amazing stuff, and I'm like, I can't think of one restaurant where we live that has Native American food. And then I started hearing about that gentleman in the Twin Cities, like on NPR. He's been in the show a lot, and it's just like, you know, really broke my heart to be driving to my home in Northfield Township and just corn and soy, and thinking about feeding all these cows and that pile of buffalo skulls, and it's like, we had it all, you know, and so I'm wondering where we might be able to experience some native food here in Michigan.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. But that's not accessible for everybody, like to go online. Not everyone can whip out their debit card or has access to the internet, especially the community I was working with, like can order things.
Well, it seems
and
like,
so I really tried very hard to, as best as I could, think about, okay, what's seasonal in the garden, or could we safely forage somewhere close to the city and try to center things as much as possible. And I guess what I would encourage you to do is think about, like, what right out here can I eat, like right around the city. Like that's one of the things Sean always talks about is like, you know, people ask where can I get, how can I make this cedar tea? And it's like, well, there's a cedar tree right out there, like, you know, and there's so many things you can do with cedar, like raising meats and beans and making tea and all sorts of delicious stuff. But there is an organization, it's not specific to Michigan, but called Intertribal Agricultural Council, and they help indigenous food producers and food entrepreneurs, you know, kind of get going, and whatever that means for them, whether that's providing food to their community or to create a value-added product. But I'm pretty sure within last year they just launched like some type of resource of like how you can find tribally produced goods. And I would definitely encourage you to do that. Like if you want some wild rice, find some tribally harvested wild rice. Don't buy the patty stuff from like California or Minnesota. Like make sure it's the tribally produced stuff, because that's supporting our communities and
what you just finished saying, which is I am very interested in wanting to support that, right, and find those foods, but then I'm constantly thinking about how much of the land is even available to produce those foods anymore. Because I've read about wild rice and where wild rice used to be and how we've, you know, drained the swamp in Michigan, which has been devastating for the land. And so to think about like me trading that like vital life force from a person for money, and then is it enough for them to be able to sustain themselves Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, I feel like I wanna make sure that I'm feeding into that cycle in a good way and not in like
Yeah,
a greedy
I will
way.
say that before they put it for sale, they're gonna make sure that their community has their wild rice. And so if they're selling it, like, it's okay.
You can assume it was an honorable harvest.
I would say it's honorable harvest, and like, you can feel more rest assured that it was harvested along those guidelines if you purchase it from a tribal producer or harvester rather than, the patty grown stuff. You know, and that goes to, there are a lot of, you know, fisheries, tribal fisheries are huge, especially, here in Michigan. You know, I think, I don't know if all of them, but I know several of the tribes in Michigan have fisheries where they're reintroducing certain fish, and some of their tribal members, like, because of our treaty rights, there are certain fish only we can harvest. Some of that goes towards feeding our families and communities, and some of that, in some situations, can be sold, so that produce a livelihood. Again, like, people are using this cultural knowledge to do these things in a sustainable way. And, you know, I think this usually is the case with a lot of, like, smaller producers, regardless native or not, are willing to talk about their practices, but native people will be super happy to, like, give you the full story of their wild rice, and might even invite you sometime to come out and harvest.
Right. So if we're searching, how do we know that it's a true native?
Look for a specific community that it's tagged to. If they'll be transparent about that.
The label will have a name and an address and contact information for who packaged it.
You'll also, yeah, true. And in the Upper Peninsula, you might see signs by the road that say like hand harvested wild rice and things. And same, like, ask questions. Like, they should be able to tell you that either the specific community that harvested it or the individuals or both. Like, you know. But yeah.
There are people who are moving species north, actively doing that, moving trees north. And the other thing about sustainability is if everyone pulls bark off the trees to make canoes like they used to, the trees will die. There are too many people in this area to live sustainably on certain subsets of plants in our area.
Yeah, and I guess one thing, like, and I know it doesn't solve all of the things of what you're saying about limited resources, but do we all need a canoe? Do we all need a car? Like, we do because of the way the system was created in Michigan, but in other communities where the system was created differently, they don't.
You could share stuff
You
and
could
tools.
share, or like, cities are walkable, like, that's what going back to, like, a lot of this stuff was human created, like, if we are a little bit, slow down a little bit, and are a little bit more thoughtful, like, there's a completely different way we can be living. And like, really living, not just, like, whatever it is someone's out here doing, surviving, I guess, you know.
I think there are truths on both sides, because we do have a much larger population too, so addressing some of the things you say, I mean, we can't all move around and follow the whatever is wildly available at the time. And I always find it interesting. You know, I feel that I can afford to buy more local. I can afford to buy more organic. I don't do as much as I should, but I feel like I can. But you look at the prices for those things compared to what's in the grocery store. And if you look at like the Myers Circular, everything that's on sale, Doritos, soda pop, that's what's on sale. That real food's not on sale. That's the way it happens.
This goes
all the
to
time.
some, like, I guess, some larger, like, policy questions of, like, why is food so expensive?
Yeah.
Like, what are we giving subsidies to? Like,
Yeah.
why is it so expensive?
Another thing that
Fresh
addresses
food?
that,
So it's like, again, with the food system, like, if there's so much work to be done. I completely hear you though, like, it's not an accessible choice.
not everybody can do it. But I think
And
another
that's partly
thing,
like why organizations like the one I work for and like others doing food justice work, why we do it is because we, in our core, believe that it should be a choice for everyone. Not that you have to grow your own food, but if you wanna grow a garden, I wanna make sure you have seeds and land access, like.
I read recently also related to that, it's partly a problem in the US. If you look at many European countries, the percentage of their income they spend on food is much higher than our percentage. We expect it to be really cheap. We're the same way with gasoline. We expect it to be, really, really cheap, less than $3 a gallon. They're paying $6, $7, $10 a gallon in Europe.
And if anyone knows anything about externalities, somewhere that is being made up. Like exploiting people, the land, something is paying that additional cost that we aren't. So, anyhow.
Yeah,
you didn't
right.
come here to hear me talk about economics.
I'm actually getting really interested in where this conversation is going, which is why I knew I had to say something, because otherwise we could just be here talking about that stuff all day. So I do want to make sure that everyone has a chance to have a little break before we move into the next section of material. So I'm sure we can still continue to have a little bit of conversations here and there, but if you need to go to the restroom or if you need to get some more snacks or whatever, we'll be reassembling back here at 2:30 to make sure that we keep moving on time. So yeah, feel free to carry on.
Thank you very much.
Nicole is a graduate of Eastern Michigan University, graduating with a double major in anthropology and art history. She began working as a docent at the University of Michigan Museum of Natural History in the spring of 2019, when UMMNH opened in its new location in the Biological Sciences Building. Since beginning as a docent, Nicole has worked as the interim office manager, floor manager, and will be assuming the temporary role of student affairs and program manager, where she will oversee the docent and school and group programs. Nicole has spent the last 2 summers on paleontological excavations in Texas. What?
I said it's a mouthful word.
Yeah, it is. I was a little nervous about it. Working with skeletal animal remains ranging from 10,000 to 3 million years old, and plans to return to Texas next year. Yay.
Yeah. If any of you at the end of this are like, you know what? I feel like I could hang out with her for 3 months nonstop. You can talk about it. You can go to Texas. You probably won't. You'll be like, that's enough of that.
But maybe not go to Texas.
Yeah, Texas. We can talk about that. Texas is
My
cool.
parents live there, so.
Oh yeah, and I'm actually not in a particularly cool part either. But yeah, so hi, I'm Nicole. As Jen just said, I've done a range of things while I've worked here. I did start as a docent, and docent's kind of just like a fancy word for like an interpreter in a museum. But so hopefully today what we're gonna do is I'm gonna give a brief introduction on interpretation. Then I will take you upstairs and we will do a tour. And then we're gonna go into our Michigan gallery. And in that gallery we have 5 different ecosystems in Michigan, and as I'm sure you all know, you probably know way more about Michigan than I do actually. I'm really kind of a dinosaur girl. But I'll divide you up into groups to talk about those ecosystems, and then you're gonna present to one another on those ecosystems. Sound good? Sound exciting? Maybe? So I wanna talk about interpretive skills. So what is interpretation? And mind you, so I'm coming from not a professional education background, bear that in mind. And I also like to switch back and forth between my 2 majors. If anyone asks me a particularly technical question about one or the other, I'll be like, I majored in so if you ask me an anthro question, I'm like, art history, that's really what my heart is. Yeah, so interpretation is basically conveying what you know to an audience. So a lot of the stuff we do here at the museum, so we give tours. I will talk about this we call a hands-on discovery station. And then we also do school programs, so we have a lot of students coming in here as well. And one of our goals after having a meeting with people who are teaching to someone is you want them to leave knowing hopefully something new, but also inspired.
So maybe they won't remember that you said that like trilobites existed for like millions and millions of years, but they'll remember, you know, how cool they were, what they looked like, or something like that. So leaving inspired. So some skills of a good interpreter are, first, you should have a theme when you're giving a presentation on something. And they've actually done studies, and if you tell people ahead of time what your theme is, they're gonna leave with like a better understanding of what you said than if you just go into it. So even if you have a theme and you don't tell it to them, they still might interpret that as just a bunch of jumbled things. So letting people know what your theme is very important. Also being enthusiastic. So if I was to be up here and I'm talking about this, you're not gonna enjoy it, you're not gonna remember what I say, you're not gonna care. So you'll remember me. I think that might be what a lot of people get from me talking, is just me. But then also group management skills. So I predominantly work with children, and that's actually where I like working with children. I think it's really fun. But being able to keep them with you, and especially if you're walking through the museum. So usually when I work with kids, we're actually in this room, so it's a little bit easier, you know, they're a little more like contained. But like if you're going through a museum, if you're giving a tour, if you're outside, keeping the people with you so that they can also see you, stuff like that is very important to have. Voice, inflection, you don't want to be too monotone. If you're talking to kids, you always kind of up it up a little bit. And body language, you want to look open, particularly with like, so hands-on discovery stations are kind of, you're just stationed in a gallery and you want people to approach you, but if you're standing there and like, they're not supposed to be on their phone at all, but if you're like on your phone or you're reading or you're turned away, people are not going to want to approach you. And then telling stories. So I think, I have this particular story I'll tell you guys when we're upstairs. I think that's one of the things that tends to stick with people is stories. And I think from listening to Shiloh, which was amazing talk, but I think we're going to remember a lot of like her personal stories and stuff like that from what she said. And know when enough is enough. So I could stand up here and bore you with a bunch of facts about what I'm going to talk about. But when you start to notice someone starting to disengage with you, that's when you should know, move on to a different topic, or maybe they're just done talking. Don't bore people with too many facts, and know your audience. So, like I knew you guys were coming in. I figured you were all adults, that was correct. But you know, with kids, you're gonna wanna engage with them in a different way than teenagers, and teenagers are different than adults. So with kids, you're gonna wanna have lots of movement. So when we do programs, a lot of our kids' things, we have them stand up, we have them dance, we have them sing, lots of things for them to touch. Which I think everyone enjoys, but you know, that's particularly good with kids. And then teenagers, least favorite group to work. And I mean that in the best way. But you know, they're at that point where they're, especially in this capacity, so I'm not sure like going forward how you're gonna work with students or people in general. But a lot of them who come here are kind of forced, and to an extent, to be here. So they don't really want to be here, and they don't really want to listen to me talk about dinosaurs, and they really just want to talk to their friend. So if you have groups of teenagers, having them work with one another, they're going to get a lot more of that than like you just talking at them. And then like, you know, adults, you know, I think adults, you can talk to them a lot more about certain things. Definitely what you say to adults is different than what you say to children. So did everyone, well, probably not everyone, who came in upstairs and saw like our main atrium? So most people. Did you happen to look up in the air and see, do you want to guess what those are?
Pterodactyl.
Well, there is a Quetzalcoatlus, but the ones in the above the master. What was yours? No. I heard it. Whales. But yeah, so they're whales. So I think people, when they're in there, you think, they're in there, it's a pterosaur, some type of flying reptile. But those are actually whales, and the thing about those whales, and I won't get into this when we go upstairs, but they have little legs. So if I'm talking to a kid, I might say, oh, they have these small legs, they weren't used for much, and then I will move on from there. But if you caught, I said they're not used for much, which means they were used for something. So with adults, I can tell them that they were used in mating, is what the little legs were for. So stuff like that. So think about your audience, think about what you're gonna say, I know. Sometimes people will be in a group, and like if it's a mixed group, and they'll say, well, you said that, but so what were they used for? And I'm like, we'll talk about it later. But yeah, so knowing your audience, and then ask questions. So especially with like tours, if I get up there and just talk to you for 30 minutes, it's gonna be boring, you're not gonna be engaged. Ask people questions to get them involved in what you're talking about. And I think, yeah, that's really all I have on that. Very brief, because I really wanna get upstairs. But does anyone have any like questions about interpretation skills or anything you're maybe perhaps nervous about? Yeah.
Well, I was just reading in the email we got, it was mentioning different types of interpretation, like interpretation.
Yeah. So those materials weren't from like the museum materials. I did look over them though. But I think like the interpret torture, which I thought was pretty funny, kind of gets into that know when enough is enough. So I think a lot of us, or me personally, like I can get really enthused and tell you a bunch of facts and not engage with you at all, and then you're just sitting there thinking, please, quiet. But yeah, stuff like that. And in entertainment, I think, you know, you want to entertain. I think, and that's the main thing here with the museum, is that you want people to be entertained and have fun and enjoy what they're doing. And it's different because like we do tours for the public primarily. So school groups, we really don't do tours for them because, you know, they have a certain curriculum that they're trying to meet. And we don't necessarily want to try to work with that curriculum for them for those certain things, for like tours at least. But when we do like public programs or school group programs, so like we would have like a school group come in here and, for example, what's a program? Dinosaur adaptations. So that is meeting some curriculum, but you still want it to be fun, and you still want them to, you know, we're a field trip actually, so they're not really, it's not school, it's like a more of a fun thing to do there. So you want it to be fun, you want it to be engaging. Did I really answer your question? I don't think so.
Interpretation is, here's the audience, here's what you want to teach them, and your job is to teach them how they care about it or how it's relatable to them, to be that interpreter of the knowledge in a way, a language that is, you know, that audience can relate to. So.
Yeah, and leaving, like I said, leaving inspired is probably the main thing, especially with us.
Well, and it's, you know, with lay people, make them more interested in nature, and that's really, we're gonna do it through these skills, so it's kind of what we've been doing all along.
Yeah, and I was very curious. I wish we could see your like entire curriculum to know what you had all learned, because I genuinely think you're probably gonna know a lot more about the Michigan Gallery than I will. But if we were to go upstairs and talk about dinosaurs, I would be the one. Yeah, I think literature is really important, and yeah, so just kind of, and I wonder how, like, going forward, what everyone kind of hopes to do with this, and you don't have to necessarily tell me, but like I watched some of the videos that were linked in the curriculum, and I saw like a lot of people being in like parks and stuff like that. So, and we do a little bit of that, not necessarily in a park, but we will go out to like other places and have like very brief, like, we're coming back from COVID still, but like going to like the art fair and stuff like that. So we did, summer before COVID, we had a giant, actually it's the mural when we walk out there, we can look at it. It's a sturgeon made out of bottle caps, and stuff like that. So, you know, we're doing this fun activity, but we're also giving you some information about sturgeons and like how we're trying to repopulate the sturgeons in them. So making it fun, but like weaving in this narrative of something, like whatever it is you want to get across personally. So when I go upstairs, so personally I'm going to be talking about human impacts on our environment with regards to Michigan. So yeah, it's like, think about what it is that you want them to go away with, and that's what you want to get to. Yeah, it's very cool. Any questions? Any more questions? Yeah, please.
How is this different than education? Like
It's not.
teaching?
So I was thinking about that when I heard you say earlier that you were a teacher, and I said, he'll know more than me. So, I mean, I think probably I would argue it's less formal.
Okay.
And, you know, maybe I have a little bit more of an, I have an agenda.
Well, I was like, I've like slightly questioned a friend about this too, and I was wondering if it was like the philosophical underpinning, whereas we tend to think that like formal education is like prescriptive, like more of a I know the answer sort of thing, and I'm giving you the knowledge, and from an interpreting foundation, it's like, hey, I've got this thing I think's really cool, and like let me take you along for this ride.
Yeah.
And that like I don't know all the answers because like no one can ever really know the answer. But like here's how I understand it.
Yeah.
And so anyway.
No, I think that's really good. And that's also, so maybe we do that more with leading questions. So like, for example, so I have these two skulls out here. So I'm gonna pretend you're all children. Or even as adults, I would ask you to come up and say, what do you notice about these two skulls?
One say.
Yeah, yeah. This one has canines, size, yeah, molars. So maybe a little bit more having them lead the conversation. Like you ask these questions and then see where we want to go from there. And it's the same thing with knowing it when enough is enough. So if someone comes up and they're like, "What is this?" I can say, "Well, what do you notice?" And then they're kind of like, "What is it?" And that could be all they really care to know. They just want to know about it. But maybe you have a kid who's like, "Hey, what do you notice about?" And then they're like, "Well, I don't know, they like pointy teeth." And I'm like, "Oh, what do you think those pointy teeth are for?" And stuff like that. So you're really kind of leading them and getting to them answer. And I think they're gonna remember that more than if I just go, "This is a coyote skull, it's carnivore." I don't have anything else fun to say about that. Yeah. You know, I mean, and you can tell them.
You will be tested.
You will be tested on this at the end. No, but, and you know, and I think also making things a little bit more, I want to say like you make them special for people. So if you were to have, and I feel like maybe some of what you might do in the future is like, you know, you go out in a park or whatever and you have a few objects and you want people to come up and talk to you. One thing with it you should probably do is not put everything you have out in front of you. So have a couple objects. One, it's just gonna be too much to look at if you have too many out, but also kids have a tendency to come up and grab and then they break. But then also I think if you get talking to someone for a long time, and I've done this a lot, and I think a lot of our docents do it as well, if someone's really interested, then you can say, "Oh, if you're interested, I have more things to show you." And you can say like, "You have," I thought this was attached, it was not, like a bear skull or something like that. You can pull, like, you're like, "Oh, you were so good, let me show you something else." So making things, there's like, it's like more memorable if they have a little special something that everyone gets to see. And you know, and it's kind of different here as well because we're in a museum. So objects, I'm at no like loss for having objects. There's plenty of objects, there's things for us to look at. But when you're out in the public, so like if you're somewhere having a few things to talk about, I mean, people are gonna be curious and they're gonna wanna come over. And it's a nice talking point is to have something, if you can.
I'm also a teacher. And,
wow.
And you know, throughout the year, we go through progression of all different things we teach about. So it kind of keeps changing up. Do you ever get bored, like going over the like same tours or same things?
No. Well, for one thing, I think we're very lucky in that our tours get to be, their phrases like highlight tours. So some of our docents, and this is me being in bad form, I usually call my tour Nicole's favorite things. So it's really what I'm interested in. But other docents, I think it also helps them to frame what they're going to talk about if they have like a more concrete theme. So it was really, so the human impacts one is one that a docent came up with. Or another one did like, this is very broad, but it was like underwater themed. People talk about the mass extinctions. If you go up into our gallery, and unfortunately for everyone, we will be closed when we're done with this, so you can't really go explore after this. But we have these pillars that represent all the mass extinction Earth has gone through, so that's someone else's tour that they talk about. We even have a very cool 6th mass extinction, because maybe we're in one right now. And I say maybe as in we definitely are.
Yeah.
I got distracted by the extinction.
But I got my undergrad in interp and environmental education, and so there's a ton of books, whole curriculums based on it, and from what I recall is that there was a lot of emphasis on those intangible connections that aren't part of our formal education. So why is this important? Why do we want you to care? You know, and that's the bridge. It's not just communicating the knowledge, but it's that care component that's not generally part of our formal education system.
And so when I spoke to Sean, and actually the way she phrased it, I was like, this is very poignant. Talking about, hopefully this is not a spoiler, that mastodons are no longer with us. But she said, I don't know. But she said, you know, we missed them by just a minute, you know. And thinking about that, I think that's something that we really, I mean, working in this context, I think is something we should be really aware of, you know. We really did just miss them by just a minute.
Yeah, you trail off that.
Talking about them. Also, the whales weren't found in Michigan. You know what? I really want to wear this headset though. I really just don't want to break anyone's ears with that shriek.
But I want to talk today about our mastodons, and as I told you, my theme is kind of going to be human impacts on the environment, starting with our mastodons. So mastodons are a Michigan state fossil. I think most people are kind of maybe more familiar with their more famous cousins, mammoths, but they're actually broke off from each other a long, long time ago. So mammoths are actually more closely related to the modern elephant than mastodons, even though you think prehistoric extinct animals are more related. Anyone want to guess which of our mastodons right here is real bone?
The one on the right.
Season, he was fighting with another mastodon and got a tusk to the jaw, and then since it did not smooth over, we think that is what killed him and he did die. Now, if you remember my theme, human impacts on our environment. So imagine that all of us are together in a group and we're walking along and we find a giant dead mastodon. What do you think we're gonna do? But they were able to tell that this trackway is from a male mastodon that came along by itself, and then later on a male or a female and her calf came along and walked in the same steps. So it's showing us that, you know, mastodons were taking care of their young, that the males were probably solitary, you know, the females might have.
You know, when they were made, first time ever.
No, it's very, and we don't have fur. Okay, we used to have fur. Darn. So we do have fur from mastodons though, or actually I think it's mammoth fur because things against Siberia, but and this is just more about mastodon coats. This is a mastodonism.
What?
Sorry.
I did not hear what you were saying.
This is a mastodon, wasn't it?
It's
a mammoth.
Yes, so it is a mastodon.
Thank you. But yeah, we got 2 layers, kind of like, you know how dogs have like an undercoat, kind of similar to that. And then there's a special surprise, museum themed underwear.
It's a naked mastodon.
Yeah, that one's for kids. That's a lot. Like as you talked about, like aging, you also know, you know, just how they behave.
That's how they age deer, and they look really similar. Like they've got that outer coating that's wearing
Yeah.
down from use.
I was thinking like if you got bit by that bad boy, it wouldn't matter that they were
Herbivore?
Yeah, it does not matter. No, and I just like to imagine how they were so horrified, like what's this huge meat eater running around. And it's also interesting too that mastodons were similar to us, but they had 3 sets of teeth. So they had like a baby set, adult, and like another set that would come through. Yeah, nice. Mammoth actually means breast tooth. Don't ask me. Yeah.
Does some serial killers do that?
We're trying to make sure we don't take up too much space. Who knows about Kirtland warblers? Yes. So this is either the first or second debate, and the jury's still out. Nest that was ever gone out to, like, they went out to get the nest from nature and took it back, and with the baby birds in it. Yeah. Not me. But yeah, I mean, there's.
Oh, 1903.
There's garbage in this diorama. That is not an accident. That's him on purpose. Just so that we can think what we're doing in our environment. Another thing I want to point out is this tree branch up here. So this is done intentionally. These holders would sometimes cut off branches as like directional things for resources. So can anyone tell me what they think this branch is pointing at? What resource it might be pointing at? No. Water, yeah, so it's pointing at the water from our river ecosystem over here. So yeah, so that is something that seems to be good. And then I'm not gonna bring this over because back in this corner, we have some whale bones and modern whales found in Michigan. Does anyone want to tell me why you think a whale? So we have an oak hickory, jack pine, wetland, dune, and then the river. So what I'm going to do, I've put numbers up at each of the ecosystems. So 1 is going to be jack pine, 2 is the wetland, 3 is the oak hickory. I want to say I made river 4, and then the dunes are 5. So your first number is where I want you to go, and I think, and we can see how we feel about it, but I was going to give everyone 15 minutes to work in your group to think about how you would interpret or talk about that ecosystem to a group. And you can pick if you want to talk to kids, teenagers or adults, you can think, I think kids might be the most fun if that's what you want to do. About 15 minutes, and then you're going to subdivide into your A, B, C, D, or D, and then that's where we're going to divide again so that you can so you're not all talking to each other who talk about the jack pine with one another. Does that make sense?
I hope so.
I know it's kind of confusing, and this is the first time we're trying this, so.
So we're gonna meet with the people that are in our habitat, and then we're gonna reconnect with the second.
That's a tough one. It's like,
Where the
we're not doing very good. We've beat a lot of them into submission, it seems like.
There's a lot of extraction too. In fact, these are parks. There's a lot of extraction on the West Coast. I was just there.
Me too.
He's going to the information compile something. No, I do interpretation.
I was on the edge of like a cliff, and I could look down, and there was a mammoth bone like 6 feet below where I was. But you're going so slow, you know, that you're not. It would be years before they get down there. Then when I went back this year, I was like,
More diversity than, I mean, it's unbelievable diversity. Just in your hand, right there in your hand, microscopic.
It's funny.
The Discovery Center, they kind of treat us by
I think because it's unique, to Michigan.
I feel like there's got to be jack pines in other places. I don't know. You go to 1 over here, which is the jack pine. If your letter is B, we're going to go to 2, which is the wetland. C is going to be our oak hickory. D, rivers. And then E is our D. And then I want you all to present to each other. I'm going to give everyone 5 minutes.
All right. Welcome. Are there D on there? Do I have a D? Yeah, you got a D. River. We're at the river. So let's take a look at our presentation here. And we'll start with the joke. Where did the fish keep his money? Where did the fish keep his money?
In the riverbank.
Oh, excellent. And we'll start with our first vocabulary word, riparian. That's Latin for bank. So this is a riparian zone. It has a riverbank. If we look at this picture, we see people on one side of the riverbank and animals on the other side of the riverbank. But then I'm not talking about the third place. Where's the third place? In the water. In the water. So the river draws these two groups together. And we see that people use the river in ways similar to animals. If you look up, careful, look up. I think that bird, that osprey, is using the river just like the people do. It's fishing, and I imagine these people fish. But I see people use rivers in a way that's different than animals. Does anyone notice a way that's different than animals?
Garbage water.
They use it as things you could do with your wastewater, and this is what people did at one point. There's other things you can do now if you want to conserve it. It's still happening. Yeah, that's unfortunately, that's true. Huge. And even if they have septics, they're all The other thing we notice on this side of the river that's different than that side of the river is I don't think that bear has a lawnmower. Turtle. A turtle. Fish are a whole class of animals. Birds are a whole class of animals. Birds, fish are a whole class of animals. Fish. But turtles are a whole class of animals, and they're not called turtles. The group that they're in is called a different name.
Terrapins?
Targets, but I was going for a more general one. Reptiles. Reptiles. So here we have birds, fish, reptiles. Can you
You are in for a treat. If you've been there, if you haven't been there, this is an opportunity to learn a lot of great stuff about some place that is really unique to us here on the Great Lakes. So if you have been to the dunes or maybe you've seen pictures, what are some of the things that you know about the dunes or you can remember from a time that you've been there? Feel free to raise your hand or just shout out.
The wind's always blowing it back and forth.
True, that is a good point. That's right, it's very windy. What else is at the dunes? Lots of sand, right? What about you, Monica? I saw your hand up.
I know, it's right by the lake.
It's right by the lake. So there's water, there's sand. In this display, what about, what other things might you notice that are located on the sand hills and the dunes? Birds. Got some birds, we have wildlife, we have vegetation that is very special to the dunes here in Michigan. So one of the things that's unique to the dunes here in Michigan is, like you said, they're big piles of sand. And so over time, if you think back to the history of Michigan, there was an ocean here many, many years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And over time, the ocean water would recede and come back, recede and come back. And if you look at this map, you can see that dunes were located even more central in the state of Michigan than just along the shoreline. So because of that ocean water receding back and forth over hundreds of thousands of years, you see dunes more within the state, and then we have our coastal dunes. And then, like you mentioned earlier, we have dunes that are formed from wind blowing on top of the piles called perch dunes. One of the things that's really unique about the habitat of the dunes is the kind of vegetation that grows there. Has anyone ever gone out to the desert, to Arizona, or maybe New Mexico, the Grand Canyon, and seen some of the habitat there and how sandy it is? Well, one thing that's special about the dunes and some of the desert climates, it's really hard for plants to grow there. That if you look over here at this model, do you see any corn growing or any topsoil? Or looks pretty sparse, huh? You can see the ground, right? Well, that's because it is very difficult for the plants to grow in the sand because there's not a whole lot of soil here. So one thing that's happening here in the state of Michigan is that because of the people walking on the plants or people driving on the plants, people building on the dunes, people always want to live on the lake, right? Lakefront property. Well, these areas are very susceptible to human damage. So what are things that maybe we can do to help protect the plants and help protect the dunes and the wildlife at our shorelines? So you guys have any suggestions?
Don't go there. Don't. State bird. Is it the robin? It is the robin. But there's another bird that we're thinking of switching out. And why is that? Does anybody ever heard of the Kirtland's Worm?
I think it's for an endangered species, and I saw it on someone's license plate, so I know it's special.
And it's the only place in the world that it is found. It's right here in Michigan. Isn't that cool? So why is it only here? Because it's very picky liver. It has to have a very specific kind of home. And the kind of home it has to have is a jack pine forest. So, what's special about jack pine? What does it like about a jack pine? Why couldn't we just have one in our backyard?
Because its limbs, when the jack pine's young, touch the ground and create a cavity underneath.
Very good, and that's where it builds its nest, and it's very picky. It will only build its nest way low on limbs, very far to the ground or on the ground. Pardon?
That's why it doesn't grow in the big ones, right?
That's right. That's why I said you couldn't just get one in your yard because it only grows down. So you have to. So how do they keep the trees small? How do we keep trees small for these to build their nests in? And this is a very specific kind of soil that only jack pines will grow in. Does anybody know what Michigan state soil is?
You have a state soil?
That's what exactly I was saying.
That's incredible.
Something sandy loamy.
Yes, very good. It's sandy. It's sandy loamy, and it's called Kalkaska soil, and that's where jack pines like to grow. So we have these fires. They used to have Kalkaska.
What is it, sandy loam?
Sandy, yes, Kalkaska. Only found here in Michigan. So that's why it's our state soil. Now, if we want to save this bird, we have to manage the area. So they do some prescribed burns to keep the trees down. So these birds can live. And these are some of its friends. So we have stinkhorn fungus. So sometimes you think of fungus as being in a wet area, but this grows in totally dry. I like that. And here's some other dry. So does anybody have any of these plants in their yard?
Oh, I love bracken fern.
I tried.
Should have read the email. Yes, I thought you were going to do this. Wetlands are pretty incredible places. When you think of a wetland, what do you think of?
Water.
Water.
Yeah, getting stuck. Something you want to avoid.
Something we were talking about it. Yes, maybe something you want to avoid, right? Yeah.
Nature's filtration system.
My horrible neighbor who's filling in the wetland across the street from.
State of Michigan could probably interfere with that.
I tried.
So, wetlands are incredibly important. And I'm sure everybody's heard of we're getting bigger and bigger natural disasters. We're getting worse floods. Wetlands are incredibly important to flood mitigation. You were talking about filtration, right? So filtering out pollutants. Obviously, they're incapable of filtering so much, right? But they're incredibly important. They support more plant and animal life than any other ecosystem in Michigan. They're incredible places. If you look around, what are some of the animals that you notice in here?
A lot of birds.
A lot of birds. Yeah, wetlands are incredible crucial habitat for a lot of different birds.
Turtle.
Yeah, turtles.
Oh, is that a muskrat?
Yeah, muskrat.
Is that a mink?
And a mink, yeah. Well, mink.
A loon.
Yeah. And then there's even one that I personally find super cool, which is the bog lemming, right? It's just a little tiny rodent right over here. We gotta check him out. Yeah, they're so cool. But he's that little guy right there. Yeah, super cute. And so when we talk about,
I thought that was a bird.
it's a lemming. The green French cigarette.
That's basically what you think of. There are other things other than oak and hickory, but the oak and hickory are the predominant trees. What I see when I look at this is just all sorts of animals. We got big predator animals, well, not that big, the owl's not that big, but big animals, predators, scavengers, just teeny tiny little guys running around here. There's just a large number of animals, visible animals. And then if you were to scoop up the dirt underneath, in your hands,
There's a lot of life around it, right? So it seems like
benefit more different species of animals in the palm of your hand and live on this continent, just in this forest floor. So really, when you see the light coming down on the leaves and it canopies the forest floor and we see all the leaves in it, what I see is food, right? It's all food. Starting from the sun creates all of it. The trees grow because there's minerals in the ground from all those microorganisms that decompose the hickory nuts and the acorns that fall out of the trees, and the birds and raccoons eat the meats. So it all just gets completely recycled. Mammal throws very intricate the amount of oxygen that these forests produce, but this is not just a full hickory forest, would be noticeable if they were gone. But you double dip because they also are a huge carbon sink. So they absorb a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide out of the air and then replace it with oxygen. Both of those things are tremendously important to people.
There's lots of food in there. You can see nuts and acorns and
Well, that's all I
mushrooms.
see is food.
Yeah.
Really, everything is food. It's almost all food. There's a very active environment. As a hunter,